Robert C Merton is the School of Management Distinguished Professor of Finance at the MIT Sloan School of Management and University Professor Emeritus at Harvard University. Merton received the Alfred Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Science 20 years ago, exactly 20 years ago in 1997, for a new method to determine the value of derivatives. He is past president of the American Finance Association, a member of the National Academy of Science, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science. Merton has also been recognized for translating financial science into practice. He received the inaugural Finance Engineering of the Year Award from the International Association for Quantitative Finance, which also elected him as Senior Fellow. He received, at 2011, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Group Melamed Arditi Innovation Award and the 2013 WFE Award for Excellence from the World Federation of Exchange. Also a distinguished fellow of the Institute for Quantitative Research in Finance, the Q Group, and a fellow of the Financial Management Association. Merton received also the Nicholas Molodowsky Award from the CFA Institute. He's a member of the Halls of Fame of the Fixed Income Analysis Society, Risk and Derivatives, Strategy magazines. Merton received Risk Lifetime Achievement Award for contribution to the field of risk management and the 2014 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Financial Intermediation Research Society. Merton received a PhD in economics from MIT in 1970 and honorary degrees for 15 universities, including the Instituto Politécnico Nacional. He is currently resident scientist at Dimensional Fund Advisor, where he is the creator of Target Retirement Solution, a global integrated retirement funding solution system. It is an honor, a really honor. I'm proud for our 7th Finance Research Congress to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Robert Merton. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me, y'all? Oh, good. Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure and indeed a treat to be here this morning. And I thank the organizers of the Congress, the 7th Congress, for inviting me to speak with you. And I thank all of you for coming out this morning to be a part of it. My topic is, in this salutatory session of the Congress, given its own research, I thought it would be appropriate to talk about issues of financial innovation, finance science, and the impact that has on our society, or at least growth and development of our society. I have a series of slides here. They are terrible slides if you have to look at them and read them. I can barely see them here, and I doubt those in the back can see them well. There's far too much information on each slide, but I don't really use slides. The slides are here, however, for a reason that if you hear something this morning that interests you, that stimulates you, does something for you, so that you'd like to try to remember why it was you were stimulated, then graciously the Congress has agreed to make available an electronic copy, if you choose to be emailed to you, of these slides. And then you'll be very happy there's so much on each slide because it's not so heavy to carry. Okay? So please understand that here. In opening, I first wanted to say something about the importance of the financial system to the general economy and society that's sometimes forgotten. The statement I will make is a well-functioning financial system is essential for growth and development. Sometimes you hear people talk about the real economy, Main Street, and the financial economy. Now, by separating the two, it must be that financial is not real. And I will report to you, I'm on the Chinese National Academy of Sciences Committee on Finance, and it's referred to as the fictitious economy in the translation from the Chinese. Well, I'm here to report to you, if you did any doubt, that the only place that the dichotomy between the real and the financial sector occurs is in old-fashioned macroeconomics books. In the real world, the two are inexorably linked with one another. You cannot separate the two. And part of my mission this morning will be to look a little bit at history, but a part of history that I think is timeless. It's as meaningful today as it was when it happened, but also to show to you in very concrete examples how finance has real effects and can have real effects. Because I think it's important for all of us who labor in this field, whether it be practitioner, academic, or both, mixed, okay, to recognize that this field is important to society. And we have an obligation to do a very good job and to make sure that the standards of quality and trust match the importance of the field. So on the issue of how is the impact of science and growth and development, I will mention briefly my colleague at MIT, Robert Solow, who also won the Nobel Prize for his work on growth theory. And in that, the important thing he showed, this is 60 years ago. You're a young audience, so that sounds like a long time ago, okay? But 60 years ago, he showed that growth was not driven by population growth or even frugality of saving, saving more and more, but rather by technology, technological innovation. That what drove the great preponderance of growth was exactly that. Now, however, how does that technology, the kind that is developed by my brilliant colleagues at MIT in the labs, nanotechnologies, financial technologies, and so forth, how does that technology get into the society, economy, so that it can actually cause the growth that it's purported to do? You actually have to take the technology out of the labs, out of experiments, and use it throughout the economy, in production and so forth, in order to realize its benefits for the increases in productivity and growth. The process of getting good ideas, well-developed ideas, technologies embedded in the economy is inexorably linked to the financial system. The financial system is the mechanism by which we can do large-scale development, finance things, and so forth. So I want to just remind us all of the importance of finance, which is sometimes forgotten, particularly in the last 10 years with the discussion of crisis that we heard of it before. Now, what I propose to talk a little bit about, finance is a science, after all. This is a research academic institution, seems sensible. And it is, by the way, a science. And then I want to talk about how it was that finance science, the most advanced parts of the development of finance, both empirical and theoretical, came to be so intimately or acceptably interactive with mainstream practice. That is quite unusual. If you look at the fields, and I don't mean just fields of economics, where the most advanced research has direct mainstream implications for practice. That's not the norm. It's not even the norm in most of economics. So how did that happen? I thought maybe you'd like to hear about that, because you're hearing from somebody who had the great good fortune to be there to see it. Okay? So that's my agenda here. Then the last point before getting to the main event is we heard the question of crisis. And often, as in the crisis of 2008, 2009, 2010, you pick which ones, it's all part of the same thing. The outcome of that was, at least initially, to say financial innovation should be pulled back in. Financial innovation, slow it down or even stop it. I want to show you that while that was the case out of this crisis, it's not always the case. And in fact, quite the opposite can happen out of crisis. And it's important, again, particularly for those who haven't been around as long, to recognize there are an array of things that happen out of crisis, not one single outcome each time. So that'll be my agenda to start with. Now I'm going to take you through some history, as I said. I'm going to start in the 1970s, a long time ago. And then I'll slowly, I'll have to do it a little fast, but I will get us to the 1980s briefly, and the 90s, and then, because I'm not going to go decade by decade, we're going to jump to 2017, August. And we're going to talk about innovation, not only in the present, but more importantly, in the future. And that's the agenda for this morning. So let's get started. You ready? Good. Okay. So first on the science, very quickly. Before the 1950s, and this is my judgment, this is not a scientific statement, this is my judgment, finance was largely a series of anecdotes, accounting identities, and rules of thumb. But beginning, and I mark it with the work of Harry Markowitz, Portfolio Theory in 1952 is important work, that's when finance began to become a science. It had a structured theory, and as you can see when you go through, it developed real data. There had been no finance data. You may not realize this. There was no real financial data available to do any serious kind of studies, not even of the stock markets prior to the 1960s. With the Chicago Center put together the first comprehensive stock returns on all the stocks that were traded on the New York Stock Exchange from 1926. Prior to that, there was nothing. A few indices, that's it. And people told stories. But there were no data to confront those stories until this happened. And I won't go into each of these, or we'll be here all day. But I will mention one thing. The first thing they couldn't resist doing was taking all these stocks on the New York Stock Exchange since 1926 to the 60s, through depressions, the world wars, you name it, and ask the simple question. If you picked a stock at random, what would the average return have been on that over this whole period? And the shocking answer was 9.3%. And why it was shocking was because no professional managers, trust departments, had come close to earning 9.3%. And that's the power of bringing real data. That was an eye-opener to stimulate understanding why and what. So I put that as at the beginning. We have the works all the way through. I'm not going to go through them here other than essentially say, this is when finance became a science. Data, systematic evaluation, confronting hypotheses with the data, and trying to understand what's going on in a systematic way. Now, moving from that, I want to move forward to the 1970s. And in the 1970s, you know, we talk about the crisis of 2008, 2009, 2010. And most of the time, you hear the next comparison, at least from I'm being provincial, forgive me. I grew up and lived in the United States. That's the one I know best. So I apologize. I'm going to use U.S. examples. But, you know, the next thing you heard in the U.S. was the last big thing as big as this was the Great Depression. Well, there was a period in the 1970s that I want to tell you about, in case you didn't know, where an awful lot of shocks, risks, impacts hit the financial system of the United States, and because of its position in the world, it propagated around the world. And I just want to give you a laundry list of some of the shocks that hit our system right in the 1970s, all at basically one time. First, the fall of Bretton Woods. What's that? For instance, 1940s, we had had fixed exchange rates. Everybody, you didn't have to know any exchange rates. You just walked around. You didn't have to think about exchange rates. Okay? Gold was $32 an ounce in the United States, period. Suddenly, all the currencies came apart. They're all floating. A risk that we hadn't thought about for a generation in practice. Next one. These aren't a particular order of importance. We had the first oil crisis. We didn't know at that time we had to number them, but there were many. And two, during the 70s, oil went from $2.50 a barrel to $13, a bit of disruption, we would say. What else happened? We had double-digit inflation in the United States, over 10%. We had not seen that inflation in the United States since our Civil War in the 19th century, 100 years. Nobody alive had any experience with that kind of inflation in the United States. Unprecedented. And of course, what went with double-digit inflation? Double-digit interest rates. Can you believe? All maturities, long maturities included, U.S. Treasuries, north of 10%. In the short end, by the end of all of this, we actually hit 21% U.S. Treasuries in the short end. Enormous shock. Again, not seen since the Civil War 100 years ago. Okay? We had a regulation that said banks could not pay more than 5%. Now, I ask you, don't have to be a finance expert to answer the following question. If you got the full faith and credit government of the U.S. government paying you 10%, how much money are people going to put in the bank at 5%? Not a lot. So there was no money at that time for mortgages, not because of credit risk, because there just was no money to fund them. You could not get a residential mortgage. That's a pretty big shock. Okay? That happened too. Now, on top of all this, what else was going on? We had 9% unemployment, maybe a little bit less than the peak of 2008, 2009, but 9% unemployment. Now, I ask you to think about, those of you who are aficionados of central bank policy, if in 2008 to 2010, we not only had high rates of unemployment, but we also had 10% inflation, do you think the policies that the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of Japan followed would have been feasible? I don't think so, because you couldn't have the kind of easing in a 10% inflation environment. The combination of high inflation and high unemployment, which came to be known as stagflation, had been unprecedented. We didn't know what to do about it. And by the way, parenthetically, I'm not an expert in this area. I asked my macro friends, who I have great respect for in that field, and I asked the question, what if stagflation comes back? Do we know how to deal with it? And the answer, as far as I know, is no. So let's just hope it doesn't come back, okay? So this was going on. The stock market fell 50% in real terms in 18 months. And, you know, I must sound like the comedian, you know, who's competing with the other comedian who says, you know, when I was growing up, I had a dirt floor for me. The other comedian said, but at least you had a roof, okay? I don't want to make this a sound of competition of the stresses of the crises that you have experienced more recently or in other places, but I would say this was a big shock. All of these things hitting the system at once. What was the response, however? Not, oh my gosh, cut back on innovation, do anything. There wasn't that much going on. There had been one. Instead, it was quite the opposite. With all these new, large, and unprecedented risks, there was enormous pressure, in fact, moved very quickly through industry to develop new markets, new tools, new securities that made it possible to better manage all these risks. You can't get rid of them. They're there. They're like the weather. But you could manage them better. So out of this, again, not to make a less, but you get this, we created the first listed option exchange. What are options? They're insurance. They're financial insurance. You buy a put option gives you the right to sell the asset at a fixed price for a period of time. It ensures the value will not be less to you than a certain amount. It's pure insurance, financial insurance. Nothing more, nothing less. We created a market to do that. With a currency floating, interest rates in double digits and fluctuations, and a stock market that had bounced around and up and down 50%, we created futures markets to better manage those risks. What else did we do? We created money market funds, various kinds of floating rate notes. The index fund, passive investment, which is trillions of dollars, and everybody takes as routine today, was first created in practice, actually in the 1970s with the Stagecoach Fund at Wells Fargo. But the big one that for the public was Vanguard, 1975. Now that's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, and both in the institutional and the retail area, a very key element of managing risk through diversification and so forth. The first institution, major institution, at least that I'm aware of, is TIAA Kraft, big insurance company in the United States, introduced international diversification, investing in not just the stocks of the U.S., but around the world as a core strategy, not some experiment or something that you were doing to try to make some extra money, but as a foundational strategy for that institution. So international diversification was part of that response. We got rid of negotiated commissions in the United States, which opened the door to the institutionalization of the financial system, which has been taking place ever since. We created a national mortgage market. Prior to this time, mortgages were all local S&Ls. You had to go to your local bank and hope that they had enough money to lend you. We created a world market for providing the capital for funding residential housing in the United States. It was put on a world base by creating a national mortgage market. And I can report to you that ever since then, there has never been a time like the time I reported to you before where there wasn't mortgage money in the United States. A little tighter, a little less, always mortgage money. That's not something that's always been true, even in the United States or other places. This was a creation that not only helped to deal with the crisis, as did these other markets to help them manage the risk, but they paid a dividend continually since. These were innovations that not only addressed the problem of the time, but continued to reward society with better financing, with better risk-bearing, and the benefits that accrued to that. And we've been earning those benefits essentially for almost 4.5 decades, okay? We got rid of some of our things. We set the basis for globalization. And the derivatives markets, these markets up here for insurance and for hedging and so forth, these financial derivative markets have been adopted around the world since. So you might say maybe the United States was a little crazy. In the middle of a crisis, they created all these derivative markets. Maybe that was a mistake. You know, a little bit like the firemen that break down the walls in a fire to make sure everybody's okay, but then afterwards you got to repair it. Not a good long-run answer. But I would point out to you, if you look around the world, including here, of course, in Mexico, derivative markets, financial derivative markets have been adopted everywhere and are widely used, not even just in developed countries, but in many of the developing and emerging market countries. That's, I think, first best evidence that these innovations have real value, unless you have the alternative hypothesis that all these countries were masochists and wanted to bring something bad to their country and introduce it. So I point out to you, what's the lesson from the 1970s? One, crisis does not always mean that the reaction should be to pull back. It can be, it said, a stimulus, a reason to implement. You know, in real estate buying, they tell me the 3 most important things for value are location, location, location. I will say, as someone who's been doing this for almost a half century, in innovation, the 3 most important things for implementation are need, need, and need. When there's need, you can get things done. When things are all kind of, well, nobody cares. You can't get anything done. So these are times, this is the lesson. The lesson here is finance didn't this. Now, the other part of the lesson on finance sciences, and I was, you know, it's always better to be lucky than smart, in the sense that we did our research on option pricing, Fisher Black, Byron Scholes, and myself. We did that work just because we were interested in the science, and I was involved in markets, we all were, and thought it was interesting. But we did it just at the time and completed the work when all of this innovation came on, and it couldn't have been implemented. There's these things listed up here, the mortgage market, very complex, okay? All these derivatives markets used to share risk. All these things you see up here could not have been done without the well-functioning mathematical models, quantitative models that allowed it, made it feasible. Nobody could intuitively do the 3 markets at once needed for an options market. The option market, the interest rate market, and the stock market, and at the speeds of which people even then were trading, try to do those intuitively. It wasn't doable. And as a consequence, the research we did, which was done as pure research, not as motivated by a particular situation, got adopted in record time. Why? Not because people were intellectually curious. They did it because they had a need. It solved the problem. And I believe that's the genesis, that whole period, which has been going on since, of how finance science, advanced finance science, got integrated into mainstream practice, and it continues to today. So I want to move on and talk about that. So none of this would have been possible, or at least as effectively as it did, if it weren't for the research that was done in universities, principally at that time, and is now done more broadly. Okay, now, I have 3 examples. I promised you I was going to move forward. We at least are out of the 70s now, okay? 3 examples, one from the 80s, of how derivative contracts in particular, which is one example of innovation, how those intangible contracts, no physical meaning to them, in fact, most of the time they're electronic, okay, how these contracts help one to solve very tangible challenges of Main Street, okay? And the first one is, I'm going to talk about briefly, is the interest rate swap. What did the interest rate swap? You may all know, if you don't, a swap is a relatively simple to understand contract if it's explained to you by someone, where you just exchange one risk for another. You pay me the return on the Mexican stock market, I'll pay you the return on the Brazilian stock market. Exchange of risk. No investment, just an exchange. That's what a swap is. You're swapping risks. Okay? Now, how did that help? A good performing bank, you know, the kind that we wish all banks were, had 2 kinds of customers, at least in the United States, but in many other places. One were borrowers. Borrowers for a house, borrowers for a business, borrowers for real estate, okay? Now, think of it, remember this is 1970s. Think of double-digit interest rates and fluctuations. Is it unreasonable that people doing a 5-year or 3-year construction project, or people borrowing money for their business, or people for their home, would want to have a fixed interest rate so that they didn't have the risk that interest rates went up by hundreds of basis points, many, many percent? It could bankrupt you. So it's not unreasonable that those borrowers would want a fixed rate. They would lock in that cost. They didn't want the interest rate risk. Good. Well, who are the other customers of the bank? Depositors. People wanted to put their money in, earn some interest on it, but be able to get it out at whatever it was worth any time they want. What did that mean? That had to be short-term. So they had 2 customers whose desires were in conflict. The providers of the funding, the depositors, wanted to be able to take their money out anytime they wanted, short-term. The borrowers wanted fixed periods, fixed rates. What did that do to the bank that was trying to do a good job of being an intermediary? It created an enormous risk for the bank because their revenues were fixed and their funding cost was going up and down. And if every time interest rates went up, they become insolvent because they were paying more for the money they were borrowing than they were receiving for the loans that they give. And that interest rate risk was far greater in banks than credit risk or the other risk, the things that banks are supposed to be dealing with. And the only thing that kept banks from going out all the time was the governments would step in and do things to kind of keep them stabilized until rates they hoped to come back. Overnight, the swap eliminated that risk from all banks everywhere in the world forever. What was the swap? The bank says we enter into a contract where we will pay a fixed rate, let's say 7% every quarter for the next 10 years, fixed rate, and would receive back a floating rate that depended on current market rates. This is an interest rate swap. There's 600 trillion notional amount flossing around the earth. So this is not exotic. Everybody is using them in the world, okay? What did this do for the bank? The bank got income on the fixed part that was fixed. They paid a fixed part on the swap, less than the fixed, so they made a spread for their services, which is a job. They were doing things for their clients. They then received floating from the other side in return for this fixed payment, which went up and down with what they had to pay to depositors. In effect, they got rid of the interest rate risk. And today, you cannot tell, if you look at a bank, whether or not if interest rates go up, that will hurt them or help them. Because they can have any exposure they want. They are not harnessed to this inexorable largest risk, which isn't even necessary. Interest rate risk, if you know how to predict interest rates, you wouldn't make your living by bank loans. You would make it in asset management, managing hundreds of billions of dollars and getting paid large fees for it. So interest rate forecasting is really not a part of the banking business, even though most people think of it that way. So it wasn't even a banking risk. Overnight, that simple contract eliminated that forever, and it's used around the world. Okay, that's the 1980s. Now, let me run to the I'm looking at my watch. Now, if I can just make this thing go, do I point it? Can I get help? Where the... too far. Okay, that's just showing you that left side is the risk of banks before the swap. That's the monthly variation in the bank's position value, if you actually valued them every month, that kind of loan. That's what it is afterwards when you've hedged it. You see those are not small differences for banks. That's the message here. Let me now turn to the 1990s. I've moved us forward. We're making progress. Don't worry, I will get you to 2017, if you're worried. In the 1990s, I'm now taking you to Germany. At that time, there was a historic event in which East and West Germany united. And of course, that's where that was the deal for the euro. Okay? The west of Germany was highly industrialized, very successful, very modern, and very economically strong. The east part of Germany was not. And one of the commitments of the united country was to try to help East German part of Germany to come up and move toward the west. That was a very important objective for the country. And there's a city in the old East Germany called Leipzig. And the city of Leipzig wanted to grow, and to grow it had to expand its electricity generation capability. Pretty sensible thing. This happens in every country. And it happened that the way they the fuel used for generating electricity there was natural gas. So they had to expand their facility to get natural gas in. They had to get more natural gas into Leipzig to expand their generation. And they were offered two proposals. Now I want you to remember, this is the city of Leipzig. The city managers of Leipzig had been in a command and control non-market economy since World War II. So they had no real experience with present values or any of those calculations. It was just done. So keep that in mind when you think of the people who were running the city, because you don't suddenly get rid of the mayor just because you had unification. These were the people that knew their city. So the two deals they were offered were, one from Russia was they would give them 15-year contract of fixed price of MCF per Deutschmark, because this is before Euro, okay? Fixed price for the next 15 years. So no price fluctuation, okay? That was one. The other choice they had, and to do that, they would have to spend $300 million for a pipeline. I know today $300 million doesn't sound that big, but this was 25 years ago, okay? So it was a big number, and a very big number for Leipzig, okay? So they had spent $300 million to build a pipeline to bring it from the east. The alternative was to take your gas from the west, from essentially the European fields in North Sea, and what you did is you paid whatever the price was in US dollars for heating oil, because that was the surrogate. There were no contracts traded in natural gas at the time. Okay, so offer number one, take your gas from the west, much less expensive pipeline, $50 million, or do the deal with the Russians, $300 million. That's your choice. If you were the city manager of Leipzig, how would you be feeling at looking at those two choices? Well, think about it a little bit. Yeah, the Russian one gives you stable prices, right? That's good because, remember, the constituency of the city were not used to seeing their electric bills go up and down. They were used to seeing absolutely constant, year after year, pricing. So if you took the West deal, what's the problem? The problem is the price is going to fluctuate as the price of gas fluctuates. I need hardly tell this audience how much fluctuation that can be. Okay? So you're thinking about, that doesn't sound very good. How am I going to deal with the people when they get their bills and they're going up 20% in a month? They're not going to be good. On the other hand, you have another problem. Let's say the deal with the Russians is X Deutschmarks per MCF for 15 years. That means you always pay X. What happens if the market price 2 years from now is X over 2? So people look in the market of trading what you can buy gas for, and they see that you can buy gas for X over 2, but the city is paying twice that. We all understand. They hedged, and it turned out it went the wrong way, but that's okay. They hedged it. Try explaining to a population, do a little introspection here in Mexico. How would you explain to a city why they're paying twice the price of the market for gas? That's a big political challenge. And you've certainly seen that kind of thing. That's the problem with hedging. When you hedge and things go the wrong way, it's very complicated to explain to people in the soundbite why they're paying more than they can buy it in the marketplace. Okay? So I'm pointing out this thing had, both of these had problems. Now the story, and this is a true story, and I even will mention the bank that did it because it's so long ago nobody cares. It was J.P. Morgan at a time when it was a AAA bank. Okay? And they got word of this, and they were sort of thinking, these managers in Leipzig are saying, this is like being asked whether I'd rather burn to death or freeze to death. And is there a third option? Okay? And the bank came up with a third option. First, I'll tell you what they said to the city managers. Here's what we offer you. We offer you the following deal. The Russians are saying X Deutschmarks per MCF, fixed rate. Buy your gas in the West, so do the option 1, and pay market prices. However, anytime the market price is greater than X, we'll refund you the difference. So you got it? You buy the market price, you pay the market price in the West, but anytime you pay more than what the Russians were doing to deal with you, we'll make it up to you, so you never pay more. So the bottom line is, if you do their deal, the bank deal, you pay no more than X, but you will pay less than X if the market price is lower. And on top of that, you won't have the political problem of explaining why you're paying more than the market price. So you get both a political as well as a financial reward. So is that a hard deal to make a choice? Which would you rather do? Always pay X or pay no more than X, but maybe less? You see how simple that answer was? Now, one of the first rules of finance you all know, in fact, the one I think we should teach children from the kindergarten is, there's no free lunch. If it looks too good to be true, it's not true, probably. So how was the bank able to give this absolutely better deal to Leipzig than the Russians? Did they highball them or something? The answer actually is no. Is it a credit risk? Maybe Russia was a better credit than J.P. Morgan. Actually, J.P. Morgan was a far better credit than Russia at that time. And on top of that, as we've seen, you avoided the political risk that if you're depending on your gas coming from Russia and political tensions occur, you might be at risk of your supply of gas, which wouldn't happen from the West, or less likely to. Okay? So how was it the bank was able to do this? The bank wants to make money. They're not doing this out of altruism. So what's the answer to that mystery? Well, the answer is the following. To do the Russian deal, you had to build a $300 million pipeline. The Russians were not going to contribute the pipeline out of their largesse. It had to be paid for in the price, right? You got to get the capital return and so forth for the $300 million pipeline. So therefore, $300 million was being paid. In the end, Leipzig would have to pay for it. I mean, the customer in the end pays for it, okay? The pipeline, however, if you do the West, was only $50 million. So by doing the West option physically, actually physically taking it from the West, you paid 50 instead of 300. That means there was $250 million on the table And the reality was in the situation that roughly it was split in half. The banks got $125 million. That wasn't profit. That's for taking all the risk of, remember, they're guaranteeing all of this. And we can get to the under the hood. But Leipzig saved $125 million. So on top of all the other features, so that explains why it was possible for the bank to create a better deal. It wasn't because of highballing or some other, it was because you actually had $250 million that you didn't have to spend, and you could split it. This was a better solution, okay? And by the way, I won't go through it. For the bank to do this, they had to take an incredible number of risks. There were very few markets. There was, no, as I already mentioned, no gas market to trade, to lay off the risk. And there were limited markets. They could trade heating oil, they could trade oil. And they had to deal with all kinds of spreads and so forth, those of you interested. But they had a lot of things. If you look at this slide, the only things they had was crude oil coils for 5 years, heating oil basis risk. They had some FX on, because remember, they were guaranteeing it in Deutschmarks. But the Western market's dollars, so they were taking Deutschmark dollar risk on top of everything else, along with oil risk. And because they put a cap on it, for those of you who are into it, they were writing an option, which means they had to worry about volatility in both those markets. Very complicated. But that's what that bank did for a living. And that's where complication should be. Complication belongs with the professionals, with the entities that do this for a living. JP Morgan did it for a living. Their shareholders understood the risks that were being taken. The people who did it knew what they were doing. And they made calculated calculations as to how they were going to manage this risk appropriately in order to be able to deliver on this contract and not bury the bank. And that's how it should be done. And that's how it often is done, but we don't write about it very often. But there's one part of this story that's not 1990s at all. And that's the following. You saw that on top of everything, Leipzig saved $125 million for an Eastern European, German city. That's a lot of money. But what else happened? A pipeline from Russia to Leipzig was not built. We all can agree, I think, maybe there are a few who disagree, pipelines are nasty in the sense to the climate, to the environment. We know that. But we build them because they provide benefits that we're willing to take that cost. So not building a pipeline is good for the environment. That's green. That's 2017. So summary on this little story, this real story, is not only did we do something more efficient for the city of Leipzig, save money, it was a better answer, but it also was a greener answer. We didn't build a pipeline because we more efficiently used the resources that were there to achieve the same result. Finance, these contracts and this bank intermediation, which are all intangibles, made it possible to produce a more efficient physical solution, both in terms of cost, but also in terms of environmental better. Now, in case you think this is an accident or one case that I pulled, I'll give you one more from the same period to show even back then. In the United States, the Tennessee Valley Authority at one point produced 1/6 of the electricity in the United States. It's a big electricity collective. And in planning for the 21st century, how they were going to expand and provide the extra electricity needed for the 21st century, they did a study. And one of the studies they came up with was the idea of, instead of just building more power plants, how about if they could organize the resources that were already available for electricity in a more efficient way by using contracts? So what they put out to the marketplace is that they would buy calls and sell puts on electricity, but only to those who could deliver it into the grid, not financial types. In other words, sometimes these were little, what they call mom and pop electricity generators. They had some solar panels and they were creating. But anyone who had access to the grid could sell these calls and buy these puts, and essentially they could sell forward the electricity. The end result of putting that out there was TVA did not build 2 nuclear power plants. That's the same as 35 conventional power plants. They got enough electricity that they needed in their plan through these contractual arrangements, meaning they reorganized all these little entities connected to the grid and arranged through contracts the organization such that they could produce enough electricity that they need without building the power plants. Again, not only a cost saving, but greener. So I hope this gives you a sense. This is not new. This is not 2017 in the sense of what's been going on. It's 2017 in terms of it being headline importance for good reason. Okay. Now, I want to move us forward in my remaining time. I'm watching, okay, to 2017. So before I move to today and looking forward on innovation and the impact of science, I'll remind you, what have we seen from the 1970s, the 80s, the 90s, and so forth? We've seen the impact that financial innovation had on the financial system by creating markets and a more efficient financial system, and then that more efficient financial system in having real impacts, whether it's financing housing or whether it's financing the expansion of electricity for growth or whatever the examples are, of which there are many. Okay? Now, the one I want to talk about is very topical for the moment. Not here in Mexico, but it's applicable in Mexico in a different way. But in the country of China, which we all can agree, like it or not, is pretty important to the world. Okay? And you probably are aware that in China that growth is very, very important. But the one thing they put ahead of growth in importance is stability. I'm reporting, not saying that's a good idea, a bad idea. And when they had what they perceived to be the financial instabilities a few years ago, their stock market went way up and then plummeted down. The reaction was shut down futures markets, do a whole bunch of things, and the shock effects of that going forward, the whole issue of worry about capital outflows, the RMB, all kinds of things. It's certainly a familiar story, told many times for many countries. So this is not a special case in that sense, but it's a big one. And the pressures for stability would favor capital controls. And maybe those are a good idea. I'm not going to give you an opinion. If you think you're going to get an opinion from me on capital controls, you're not. But why do you want capital controls? Or what is one of the costs, the unintended costs of capital controls? Think of complete capital controls. Just think of 100%, just so it's easier in your heads. Think if you had complete capital controls, no capital flow in or out. Okay? What is the cost to the country of that in a financial terms? The cost is, that means the people in that country have to bear all the risk of their country. They can't share their country's risk with investors in other parts of the world. And they can't get the benefit of that by being able to invest in other parts of the world. In other words, exchanging risks in the sense that I hold some Mexico, I hold some China, I get diversification from that, okay? And in turn, China and Mexico get the benefits of the other, okay? We all know that. And one of the few things that we know is very robust is that diversification works. It really does. There's overwhelming evidence to it, theoretical but also empirical. And to show you a sense of the cost, I show you China. And don't worry about what dates I use. I use 93 to 250. Don't use these numbers for quoting policy. These are designed to give you the idea. You understand? These are real numbers, but they're numbers not, don't worry about the period I picked. I picked 22 years. The truth is I had a colleague who had the data and I was lazy. Okay? So don't take that. What I did is say, what happens if I held the world portfolio and I just used one of the, like MCI index. That's not the best one, but again, this is just to illustrate. This is what the risk return would have been. This is standard deviation risk. That's average return, all in dollars, okay? And that's what we would have got from holding the world portfolio. That's the best, theoretically, the best diversified portfolio, right? We all know that. That's what the CAPM told us, right? What happened if you just held China in this period? Well, the realization of China is this line. Do you see that the amount of risk reward you got holding the world was much, much better than holding China? For the same risk, you get much higher returns. For the same return, much lower risk. Do you see that? I mean, that's classic, right? Now, comparing ex-post returns is not very interesting because it could have been bad luck. We all know that. So what I did is say, given what happened to the world, I don't know what the ex-ante expectation for the world was in 1983, but I do know what the world did do. That's the red line. If I asked this audience, what would be your forecast of how China did if you knew nothing, but I told you the world did that? What would you forecast China had done? Well, how would you have calculated that? If you don't know anything, you don't know whether China was going to do outperform or underperform. So it has zero alpha is what you would expect, right? In other words, it was neither underperform or overperform expectations. That seem reasonable? So how could you represent that? Conditional on what the world did, that's the red line, what do we expect China to do? Well, take the beta of China times the excess return on the world, add to it the risk-free rate, and that would be your forecast, right, with a zero alpha. In other words, neither underperforming or overperforming. If this all sounds jargonese to anyone, just think of it as common sense says that if I were going to give my best estimate knowing just what happened to the world, this is what I think I would have expected to happen to China, the green line. The blue line tells me that China did worse than expected. It was an underperformer. That's life. That's not the important part here. Do you see, you understand the three lines now? This is what, I call that my sister's portfolio. My sister's probably the smartest one in my family, but she's a brilliant lawyer, professor, but she knows nothing about finance, and she's smart enough to know she doesn't. So what does she hold? She just holds the well-diversified world portfolios. So that's my sister's portfolio, okay? And she knows nothing about finance. So us professionals should at least do as well as my sister, right? But if you only were constrained to invest in China, this is what you would have gotten in the period. But even if China performed as you expect it would, this is what you would have gotten. Worse than my sister. For any risk you took, my sister's portfolio outperformed. In jargon terms, my sister's portfolio had a much larger Sharpe ratio. This is the cost of capital controls in loss diversification. It's not small. It's a very big number. At least I think so. Again, don't take these numbers literally. A rough estimate might be the cost here would be about 3% a year. I was speaking to some of your colleagues, some who I recognized in the audience last night, and I said to them, if you were a pension fund, extra 3% doubles your money in 24 years. Twice as much money if you had an extra 3%. That's one generation. That's a short generation, 24 years. That's a big number. That is the cost of giving up diversification. That's one of the costs, but a big cost. And clearly, China or no one else wants that cost. It's a cost that is an unintended, undesired cost, but necessary if you literally impose capital controls. The question is, can we use finance innovation to get rid of that cost? Answer is yes. What do we use? A swap. Same thing we used in Leipzig, the same thing we used to solve the problem of the banks. Okay? And I'm using this because this is easier. What you have happen is, if you had capital controls, all the stocks and bonds of China have to be bought by Chinese institutions. Their sovereign wealth funds, CIC, their reserves, China, SAFE, or their pension fund, NCSSF. Okay? These big institutions, they would have to buy, along with people, but they would have to buy all the stocks and bonds of China because nobody else from the outside could buy them with capital controls. You see that? I mean, that's what it means. So they would own the stock. They would vote the stock. The cash paid for the stock would flow into Chinese companies, right? Because they're buying the stock. So if a Chinese company issued stock to raise money, the money would come from Chinese institutions into Chinese companies. Do you see that? And you see that the voting rights, the governance of those companies would be controlled by whoever owned the shares. In this case, Chinese institutions and individuals. Okay? But now, those institutions, the sovereign wealth fund, if they were enter into a swap, a total return swap, and let me tell you what the contract is. It's written up here, but you may not be able to see it. They own, let's say, Chinese stocks, all the A shares. They now enter into a contract with some foreign entity, let's say another sovereign wealth fund, Norges Bank in Norway, GIC in Singapore, wherever, okay? Or here in Mexico with one of your pension, all right? But whoever it is, it's with a foreign entity. And the contract they enter into says, we will exchange on whatever amount of money, 10 billion, 15 billion, whatever the number is, we will take the return on, the Chinese institutions will take the return on the Chinese market, total return, multiply that by that money, and pay that to Norges Bank or GIC. That's what they pay. But Norges Bank or GIC would pay back to China the total return on the world portfolio on the same 10 billion. So they exchange returns, nothing else. No cash flow here, just a contract. At the time you sign it, nothing is paid for these contracts. It's a pure exchange. One risk of $10 billion of risk of one kind for $10 billion of risk of the other. No price. It's transaction cost, but no price, okay? Now, what does China get out of this? China owns the shares. It votes the shares, and all the money goes into Chinese company that they invest. However, the return China earns is the return on their shares minus the return on their shares plus the return on world. They end up earning for their portfolios the well-diversified, my sister's portfolio, the well-diversified one. We've satisfied, by the way, if you want capital controls, does this violate it? No. Why? There was no capital flow. When these contracts were signed, no money went out of China, or no money went into China. It was a pure exchange of risk. So there was no violation of capital controls. Now, it's true, down the line, somebody is going to pay someone money out of this swap contract. What does China pay? China pays the return on China and gets back the return on the world. Do you see that? And it's the net of the two is what China pays. So when does money go out of China under this swap contract? Only when China outperforms world. Right? Because they're getting paid world, they're paying China. So the only time they actually pay money out is when China outperforms the world. Are those bad times for China? No, they're great times for China. Are those times that you're worried about capital flow out? No. In fact, what happens when China has not such good times? Say, where their performance is, after the fact, worse than world. Actually, money flows in because they get paid world and only have to pay China, since world did better than China. So it's even more stabilizing than the capital controls, because net money flows into China when China does poorly. Now, I know I've taken this, and I'm looking at the clock. I've got 5 minutes. I'm watching it. And I'm taking you through this because I wanted to show you what's happened here. There's been no circumvention of capital controls. I'm not saying they're good or bad, but we're not getting around it. We're not finding ways to circumvent it. We're absolutely meeting the reasons for capital controls. Governance, money being invested in the institutions that matter, and stability. Not having monies flow in and out, especially in tough times. Okay? So it meets all those policy objectives, except what? Now, we get that risk reward versus that risk reward. It's a pure gain of the loss in diversification. And we've done it without disrupting anything in China, without circumventing any policy in China, good or bad policy, that's not my pay grade. All I want to do is make it less expensive, more efficient. I sometimes use the analogy of taking medicine. We take medicine to either treat us or cure us. What do we know? I mean, in my country, we have on the television all the time, people are happy, you know, they're getting this wonderful medicine. But then they say, this medicine may make your kidneys fail, cause heart attack, make you feel sick to your stomach, and make your hair fall out. That doesn't sound good. Why do we do it? Well, we call these things side effects. That's a polite way of saying they make you sick. Clearly, the drug company or you don't want that. Why do we do it? Because we're willing to take that in return for being cured or treated. How would you react if you had the same efficacy, that is to say, the same degree of potency of the medicine, but you had no side effects? Would anyone want to argue that I think side effects are a good idea? I don't think so. That's what we're doing here. We're using finance to just make it better. And then let others decide what should be done. You decide as a collective whether capital controls with all its costs, other costs, are a good idea or not. But let's at least get rid of a cost that we can get rid of. That's what innovation, that's what finance can do for a real economy in the 2017. Now, in my last, I've still got 2.5 minutes, okay? I wanted to show you this one because it's live, and it's a big country, China, and it's a big issue in China, all the way up to the very top of the government, because these are decisions that go beyond financial decisions, go beyond growth, they go to the whole issues. I wanted to show you how finance can be very, very important, not as a little add-on, but as something that can fundamentally have an impact and help make decisions. It is not hard to make the decision that I prefer this for my country than this, and then debate the rest. All of this can be done with contracts that are traded today and have been for decades. There's no new contract here. We don't have to worry what they legally will hold up. They've all been adjudicated. This could be done tomorrow. No new institutions are created here. I won't have time, but for those who get the slides, I give you a list of the advantages of using the swap, which has to do with its lower cost. Outsiders are not worried about expropriation. You don't have credit risk. There are all kinds of very attractive features for doing this. The most important one I would mention is the cost. How would China do billions of dollars of these swaps? I can tell you, dude, if China has too much China, that's what it means when you're concentrated, the rest of the world has too little China because the world has to add up to the world portfolio. Therefore, I know there's a natural demand for China outside of China. I don't have to convince them. They want it, whether it's the Norges Bank or GIC, Singapore or Norway or the United States. We want more exposure to China if China has too much of it. Therefore, we know who to go to. And if you're institutions, you don't have to go through Goldman Sachs or Deutsche Bank or any other. You just go straight to each other. The swap price is easy to calculate. There's nothing complicated about it. You don't need high-tech people to do that, high-paid people. And you don't have credit risk because your counterparty is the sovereign wealth fund of a country or a central bank. And you know each other. You can put all those people in a room. You know, there's 43 sovereign wealth funds. You can put them in a room, big room, but you can put them in a room. So that's a fast pass. This is very practical, and it could be done tomorrow. Now, enough on that. I want to say, as I'm walking, to say one last thing. First of all, here in Mexico, and this is to all of you involved in innovation, particularly the students or younger people saying, look at all these things that happened in the last 50 years. Gee, we're kind of late to the game. Is it all over? My statement to you is not, you haven't seen anything yet. That's why I wanted to show you how you go after China. This was not high-tech in the sense this was not complicated. Those who study finance, swaps an easy idea. That's actually good when you want to implement. Because if it's simple and market-proven, people will do it. If it's very exotic, it may take years to convince people to do it with something the size of a pension system or a sovereign wealth fund. You see? So sometimes it's good to have something simple. But the innovation is how you did it. You solved problems. You went out and addressed a real-world problem and came up with a better solution. And we do that in engineering and in physicals. We can do that in finance and have been. And that's the excitement I hope you feel. We can change the world for the better. And these are tools that could be used in a country like Mexico very well. And it allows you to adapt to a lot of sometimes conflicting objectives, public policies, and so forth, without imposing the costs. And, of course, if you can find new ways to do things, better ways to do things, if you can understand risk better, if you can understand prediction better, if you can understand how to measure performance better, you can make the world economically and therefore socially a much better place. So I thank you very much for this morning. Thank you for your attention. And I guess we take questions now. Thank you.